For today's devotional, we will be meditating on Psalm 114. This is a beautiful psalm that is considered one of the psalms that is part of a group of psalms that is called the Egyptian Psalms of Hallel. These psalms were sung during the Passover holiday, and it was thought that Psalm 113 and 114 were sung prior to the Passover feast, and Psalm 115 through 118 were sung after the feast. So Psalm 114, it discusses the Lord's faithfulness and God's power in delivering his children out of Egypt when they were in bondage and slavery for 400 years, and how God led him out of there and into the promised land ultimately. So in Psalm 114, verses 1 and 2, it starts off by reading, "When Israel came out of Egypt, Jacob from a people of foreign tongue, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion." So, this was the central act of redemption that was seen in the Old Testament. And Israel, the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. That's a long time. So I'm just thinking, they know no other land. This has been their home, but at the same time, they didn't feel like it was home because they were surrounded by people of a foreign tongue. I'm just thinking, if I lived in a land where I didn't speak the language or understood the culture, I would feel out of place. So in the same way, the Israelites just knew that that place was not their home, and that was not God's best for them. So he had a plan to take them out of that land. But even then, even though there are times we know that there are better things to come and how God has plans to prosper us and not harm us, so many times do we think we know better. And how many times did the Israelites want to go back to Egypt just because it was more comfortable, even though it wasn't, just out of fear and not trusting that the Lord would be there for them. But despite all of that, it says Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. So God was so faithful. He didn't just abandon them or leave them empty-handed. It says Judah, which was the leading tribe of Israel, became God's sanctuary. God desired to make his dwelling place with his people. A lot of times we think of the tabernacle or the temple being the place that God resided, but ultimately, no, he desired to abide with his people, and it says Israel his dominion. So what does dominion mean? It means to take care of, to manage, to govern, and that is what God did. He dominated his children, but in a way where he did this to ultimately he wanted them to honor him and to serve him. Number 2, we see God's power seen through creation. In verse 3 and 4, it says, "The sea looked and fled, the Jordan turned back, the mountains leaped like rams, the hills like lambs." So these verses, it just personifies nature and how it stood in reverence and fear of the Lord. These verses showcase the miracles that were seen during the Exodus journey. The first miracle was the parting of the Red Sea. It says the sea looked and fled. Next, we see the Jordan turned back. This was the last miracle right before they entered into the promised land. Verse 4, the mountains leaped like rams, the hills like lambs. So this is likely referring to Mount Sinai, when God manifested his presence and when he provided the 10 Commandments to Moses. When his presence came on that mountain, it said that the mountain shook. There was an earthquake. And it says in this verse, the mountain leaped like rams, the hills like lambs. So it's almost like this joyous experience, right? That even creation is overjoyed in how he shows up. And so as we see these miracles, we see that even things as big and powerful as the sea and the mountains, even they submit to his authority. Verse 5 and 6 says, "Why was it sea that you fled? Why Jordan did you turn back? Why mountains did you leap like rams, you hills like lambs?" We don't know who the author is of this psalm, but I think it's kind of funny how he almost teases creation, being like, who are you to stand against the Lord Almighty? You know, so as strong as you are mountain, as strong as you are river, you know, you are powerless to stand against a powerful God. So how should this make us respond as we read these verses? We read in verse 7, it says, "Tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob." So this should ultimately bring about a sense of reverence and fear and trembling as we see how powerful our God is. You know, it should bring a sense of humility. So the last verse, it says, "Who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water." So this last verse, it shows, you know, we were seeing all these other miracles that God was doing, but ultimately the author chooses to showcase this last miracle. And it shows that his power is not only there to divide the Red Sea and shake mountains and through these big, grandiose ways, but it's also there to provide blessing and provision for his people. There were so many times the Israelites grumbled and complained and, you know, they were thirsty in the desert, but the Lord provided for their every need. He gave them their daily bread. He gave them manna. He brought water out of these rocks, you know. So the Lord, it just shows that even though he's powerful and, you know, he's able to do everything, he desires to provide for his children because he's a compassionate God. So this psalm is, it's a beautiful psalm, just remembering the Exodus journey, but it just made me stop and think, you know, that Jesus and his disciples were celebrating the Passover prior to his death and his resurrection. So this was likely a psalm that he sang with his disciples around the time of the Last Supper. In Matthew 26:30, it says that he sung with his disciples hymns prior to going to the Mount of Olives. So Jesus likely sang this psalm, and he thought about the deliverance of his children out of Egypt, but it also made me think what was going through his mind around that time, thinking of an even greater deliverance that was about to happen through his death and his resurrection. So I pray that as you meditate on this chapter, that you would remember that the Lord desires to make his presence there with you. He is powerful to show up in your life, and he's a compassionate God that will continue to provide for your every need if you make him the center of your life. I pray that these words are a blessing to you.